Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where you are in the world joining us from. We might just wait a couple seconds for people to get logged into Zoom, join the meeting. Very much appreciate everyone jumping on board today to hear from some two very knowledgeable ladies in the science space, and very excited to be introducing them to you soon. Um, Coming to you from, I'm actually in WA, and we have team all across Australia here at Atlas Carbon, and we put on live webinars, informational webinars for our customer base and our wider network because we believe that everyone should have access to this information to make informed choices about their grazing systems and carbon opportunities. So again, welcome. Hopefully everyone's now logged in and into the meeting and going to sit back and enjoy a nice afternoon session with these two lovely ladies on screen. So I'll quickly introduce you to myself first. My name is Victoria Lawrence. I've been a team member here at Atlas Carbon and Maya Grazing for nearly 7 years now, and I've hosted many of these sessions, and this is one of the most exciting ones I have hosted in a long time. Very excited to hear from both Dr. Elaine Mitchell and Dr. Susan Orgill. If you are new to our network, welcome. We are Atlas Carbon and Maya Grazing. And Atlas is a company that started about 3 or 4 years ago now, and we partner with graziers across Australia to assess, plan, and implement high integrity soil carbon projects, bridging the science with what actually works on farm. We're all about growing your pasture, livestock, and carbon together, and very passionately do that as well. Where we've come from, you might have heard of Maya Grazing. So Maya is a grazing software management tool that really helps producers put in farm on practice the practices that build soil carbon. And it is the most advanced grazing management software for livestock producers to do that. And it uses the graziers who use it make more informed livestock decisions to boost productivity and manage seasonal uncertainty. So, what are we here for today? So, here at Atlas Carbon, we spend a lot of time talking with producers about soil carbon. And one thing that comes up again and again is people wanting clarity of what actually increases soil carbon on grazing land. We all know rainfall matters, we all know soil type matters, but there is also a growing body of work which really underpins how we approach soil carbon projects at Atlas that looks at what grazing management can do within those boundaries. That is why we are really pleased to have Dr. Susan Orgill and Dr. Elaine Mitchell with us today. Susan has been working in soil carbon for decades, and she will ground us in what we already know, the solid, well-established science around soil organic carbon. Elaine is then going to take us a step further and share insights from her latest research, which is currently under peer review, looking more closely at how different grazing approaches show up in the data. And together they bring a practical, evidence-based view of how climate, soils, and management interact and what that means on the ground for the graziers. So welcome to you both. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Victoria.
I think we'll kick off with you, Susan, if you'd like to share your screen, and we'll start
I
on yours.
will. And I think I was distracted when I was like a younger soil scientist. I'd be like dreaming of the day someone would introduce me as having decades of experience. And now it just makes me feel bloody old, if I'm being honest. Like,
Not at
and
all. Just
Elaine didn't get introduced like that. So for the record, I'm older than Elaine, hey? So
ah,
it's all good though, all good. So very excited to be presenting today to the Atlas community. Thanks very much for the invitation. My background is in soil carbon R&D. I spent a lot of time of my career working for New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, and I actually started out by running workshops with farmers around strategies to improve soil health. It was around nutrition, pasture management, crop management. And I'd always get these questions from growers around how do we build soil organic carbon? And I had started messing around with a few things and worked out like the difference between screwing around with stuff and science was like writing it down. So I did my PhD. My PhD was looking at farm management strategies to increase soil carbon. And a lot has changed since then for me in the field of research. And I'm very excited to kind of recap today what we know and what we're learning in this space. Both from the scientific point of view, from the soil health and productivity uplift point of view, and share with you some of those learnings. So my talk today will have 4 components, and to show my age, I've got 3 screens which I'm not going to use very well, and the screen that I need to click on seems to be the one that I'm not clicking on right now. First of all, I'm going to talk about the 5 things that we all agree on. So the good thing about being a scientist is that we like to have this healthy debate about things, and soil carbon is something certainly that we debate about, and it's about bettering our understanding around the mechanisms, the processes for the greater good of the planet, for producing healthy food and fibre, and for improving soil health. But there's 5 core things that we all agree on that we don't argue about. The next part of my presentation is going to be moving from the no but to having an approach of yes and let's look at this. And part of that will be focusing on the proven path forward. So what we actually know works and how we can build on that in our production systems. I also want to share some information around the kind of shovel-ready evidence to build soil carbon. So what we can do now and why we want to do that in terms of when we're looking at increasing soil nutrition, making sure that we've got good infiltration for our pastures and that we're farming in a way that actually naturally uplifts soil carbon, and the science that actually underpins that as well. All right, so the 5 things that we all agree on about soil carbon. Now, the first, Victoria introduced this beautifully just before, and it's around the fact that climate and soil type are major drivers of carbon sequestration. So there's nothing new in that. And the way that I like to describe this to farmers is that we just need to think about the uplift potential being the envelope of climate and soil type and what you can do on your farm within that envelope. So absolutely in the higher rainfall areas, you might have a greater capacity to grow a diversity of pastures and have an overall greater biomass uplift potential. But thinking about the reality of that for a farmer is that you farm within your farming landscape. So really it's thinking within your climate for your soil types, what is that uplift potential? Then it becomes around where in the landscape can you increase soil carbon? Where do you have good clay content? Because we know that soil type matters in terms of the inherent soil fertility, its ability to hold on to water and nutrients, and also the ability to hold on to and protect carbon. Now, we have proven practices to build soil carbon that are backed by decades worth of research. So there's lots in the peer-reviewed literature to say around the practices which will increase soil carbon. So how can we have a greater diversity of carbon inputs going into the soil? How can we address plant needs so that we're overcoming soil constraints so that you can put more below ground biomass in terms of the roots and root exudates? How we can have practices which better foster those relationships between plants and soil organisms to not only generate that carbon flow into the soil, but also to stabilize it. Something else we know is that we know that in the surface soil layers that it is natural for the carbon level to bounce around. So when we're looking particularly in the top 10 to 15 centimetres of soil, it's quite vulnerable to those rapid changes in maybe management. It might be changes in temperature when we're going into droughts, if we've got floods, if we've got waterlogging, and we know that that influences our soil organic carbon levels. When we're looking deeper than that, though, so if we're thinking about the protocol of sampling 0 to 30 centimetres and 30 plus in a carbon project, for example, we know that we're kind of moving away from that more vulnerable layer of soil carbon, which is going to be more climate driven, to more carbon that can be associated with clays and protected. So the higher the clay content, the more able the soil is to hold on to and protect those organic carbon molecules. The deeper we're putting it down in the profile, science says that it's more stable down there. It doesn't mean it's going to be there forever, but means that it's more stable. And the tighter it is wrapped up in well-structured soil, the more able it is to resist some of those fluctuations as well. But we also know that cycling organic matter is really agronomically desirable. It's what fuels our microbial community below ground. It drives that mineralization process so that nutrients become available. So it's actually agronomically desirable to make sure that we've got a healthy, sustainable way of cycling organic matter as well. We don't just want to stick it in there and keep it there. We want to make sure that we're incrementally increasing soil organic carbon, but we've got functional carbon, so healthy soils. What we also know is that we've got this increasing need to adapt to our changing climate. So when we're thinking about looking at research perhaps that was done decades ago, it's thinking about it in the new light in terms of what are our systems actually experiencing now? What we're seeing, I guess, globally is the fact that the global community is starting to look at some of our evidence around cropping and pasture systems in Australia for the climate change that they're going to be experiencing. So what they're calling climate change with an increase in 2 degrees is like our summer, right? So it's really important to think about the literature. Where was it done? What's the context? And how meaningful is it for today's experience? But overall, when we're talking with farmers, it's really about that practical application. So practices which focus on plant growth are so important. So grazing pressure and soil nutrition, overcoming soil constraints, maintaining ground cover. So keeping a lid on the soil so that we're buffering the soil from those bounces in temperature and moisture, but so that we're also protecting the soil surface from erosion. We know that scientifically it's proven that you'll increase carbon by doing that and you'll reduce the losses. Now, one of my favorite people in the world is Brian Murphy, but one of my favorite papers of his is this particular paper, which looked at the role between soil organic matter and soil functions. So what we have here is we have a graph where on the y-axis, which is the axis which descends on the left-hand side, we have a range of different soil functions. So things like the role of biology and biodiversity, cation exchange capacity, so the soil's ability to hold on to cations and withstand changes in buffering capacity, nutrient storage and cycling, tilth and friability, so how easy the soil is for microorganisms and roots to move through the soil, for example, water holding capacity, how big is the sponge, and aggregate stability, how stable is the soil when it gets wet and exposed. We know that all of those soil functions come back to a relationship with soil organic matter. So the bigger column or bar that you see on this graph here, the more important it is for this particular soil type. And this is coming back to soil organic matter matters for productivity. It also needs to be considered within the context of soil type. So this is a red chronosol, and for those of you who don't speak fluent Australian soil classification, that's basically a duplex soil, so a lighter textured soil over a heavier textured soil. And that heavier textured soil in the subsoil, the major part of the B2 horizon, where it's really bright in colour often, it has a pH that is above 5. So if we think about it like that, so it's not strongly acidic and it's a texture contrast soil. If we look at one of the sister soils of the chromosol, would be the black vertisol. For those of you it's thinking about vertisols, for example, so black cracking soils, we can see now we've got the same soil functions descending on the y-axis, but can you see that the shape or the length of those bars is different? So in your clay-heavy soils, soil organic matter absolutely drives biology and biodiversity. Very important. It's very important for that nutrient storage and cycling, but it's less important for cation exchange capacity, because cation exchange capacity is the clay plus the organic carbon that's in the soil. The lighter the soil, the more important that organic carbon is in providing that cation exchange capacity and buffering capacity. And that's why it's really important to think about the role of soil health, carbon, but also the soil's ability to increase carbon by thinking about soil type. So we think about the proven path forward. What do we actually know in the literature? And I'm happy for these slides to be shared afterwards. Now, first of all, in the column, we've got a range of different locations. The first through this global meta-analysis, where the papers have been published looking at global trends. Then the next couple of lines are around Australian-based meta-analysis, and then there's some New South Wales heavy literature, some of which I've been involved with. The last two are some Queensland examples. I've just captured this because this is kind of the area that I work in. But if we think about the management practices for these locations, which we have peer-reviewed literature around increasing soil carbon. These management practices are the ones that are in our AccuScheme method. It's the ones that make sense to you guys as producers and advisors as well. It's the best management practices around improved crop management, converting from degraded cropping country to pasture, making sure your pastures have adequate nutrition, making sure that you're on top of your grazing management so that you're optimizing that photosynthetic window so that we're getting more photosynthesis, driving carbon into plants and below ground to increase soil carbon. So there's things like time-controlled grazing, some of Elaine's great work that she'll be talking about, ensuring that in our pastures we've got adequate pasture establishment and grazing management so that we've got legumes, because the main driver of carbon in our soils is nitrogen, because soil organic matter is 58% carbon, 42% other stuff. The most important other stuff for us to think about for farmers is nitrogen. There's a huge amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. The way we get it into the soil is through microbes which don't need a partnership with plants, and then the microbes which do, which is our rhizobia. So if we've got healthy functioning legumes, we're grazing well so that those legumes have space to germinate and to access sunlight. They've got a good partnership because we've overcome any soil constraints so that they've formed nodules. They've got adequate molybdenum to make sure that they're functioning and fixing nitrogen. The scientific literature says that's a great way to increase soil organic carbon. So the references are in the far right-hand column here. The duration over which those studies have been looked at is also listed, and also the depth. So I've picked the ones that are mostly looking at in the top 30 centimetres because that's often where most of the literature is focused. We actually don't have a huge amount of peer-reviewed literature in Australia which has looked at subsoil carbon sequestration. So we need to dive into the literature and say, all right, what do we understand about the processes and how transferable are they to subsoil processes? Now, these sequestration rates, these are carbon sequestration rates. So we're not talking about tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, but they range in this peer-reviewed literature for this area of Australia from 0.2 up to about 1.5 or more tons of soil carbon per hectare per year. These are multi-year studies. When we look at what is driving that sequestration rate, there's a few things. First of all, it's the initial starting soil organic carbon percentage. So it's thinking about lower levels for a given envelope of climate and soil type has a greater uplift potential. So climate is important, soil type is important, and then it's the magnitude of the management change. So going from building the crap out of it with cropping to a perennial pasture which has good grazing management and adequate nutrition, that's the biggest uplift potential, right? But there's a whole range of stuff that can happen in between that. Solutions must be place-based. It's all about contextualizing solutions. So while this stuff works, it doesn't mean it works on your farm. It's about thinking, what is the best fit for my soil type, my climate, and my farm business? That soil carbon increases aren't linear. So why I've said here, maybe it might be from converting by managing grazing pressure over 8 years. Some of my work in southern New South Wales out around Cobar, it was around about 0.2 of a tonne per hectare per year. It might be lumpy. Most of the change happens in the first 5 to 10 years of practice change, and then it starts to plateau off, and it's thinking, what is the next practice change that you're going to put in place to get the next increase? Now, these are living systems, right? So the more you feed the soil with soil organic matter, the more biological activity that comes back into the soil, the more those soil organisms will start to do all the things that we've spoken about with Brian Murphy's work around soil functions, but also they'll be respiring carbon. So we need to make sure that we maintain the increase in soil organic matter and always thinking about additional practices to further stabilize carbon in our soils. So I like to think about them as the core benefits of carbon farming or increasing soil carbon rather than the co-benefits. So the practices which we pick out of the literature, which are the same as the 13 eligible management activities, which are in the AccuScheme method, are around pasture type. So making sure that we've got good perennial base, we've got legumes in there, we've got a biodiverse pasture, so multiple organic matter inputs. Grazing management, keeping ground cover on and making sure that plants have space. Crop sequence, so in our cropping systems, making sure that we've got, the key is making sure that you've got well-nutritioned pasture phases in there. And if you can't, it's been around making sure that you're doing no-till and maximizing stubble retention and soil nutrition. And there's also some really innovative new hard-seeded legumes in cropping soils. Organic inputs to soils, really important. So how do these actually drive or influence soil carbon? So a lot of them you can see in this graph here will increase carbon input, more organic matter below ground. They'll add carbon to the subsoil around perenniality, so perennial pastures putting carbon in the subsoil, and they'll contribute soil nitrogen. With some of our stubble management and reduced soil disturbance, what we're really looking at is taking the accelerator off the decline in soil organic carbon. So rather than tilling the soil and burning stubble, it's not actually reversing it and building soil carbon, it's just not declining it as much as it is. So that needs to be paired with another practice. Perenniality, actively growing plants and living roots in the system, minimizing disturbance, and contributing organic matter through an organic amendment or through making sure that you've got plants which are cycling nutrients is really important. Now, the benefits of these, similar to the graph I showed you earlier, come back to the whole farming business. So it's around reduced fertilizer costs. It's buffering soil from temperature extremes, which is really, really important, obviously, when we're seeing some of these hot, dry summers. Higher biomass and yield, so you've got higher productivity, lifting your DSC, managing the diversity across your farming system, perhaps actually having broader sowing windows in some of our cropping systems because we've got better soil moisture retention. When we're thinking about rainfall, it's not just thinking how much rain did you get, it's like how much rain did you really get, like how much actually infiltrated into the soil. They're the real benefits of building soil organic carbon. And it's really hard when you look in the literature to disentangle those, right? Because it's a living system. So is it the fact that you've got good grazing management? Yeah. And it's also the fact that good grazing management leads to good infiltration. It helps with that buffering, which will then help with our microbial diversity, which helps with nutrient cycling, nitrogen fixation, and it goes on. So it's a living system, and we really need to keep that in context as well. There are very strong links with soil biology around being able to scavenge and acquire nutrients, the volume of soil in which the plant roots can explore for nutrients and water, and the partnerships which they make with soil organisms. Like, it's not rocket science, it's like even better than that, it's soil science. But it just makes sense, and farmers are very used to driving this system, right? And it's just thinking about maybe it's not always making the car bigger and faster, it's making it run more efficiently. There's some really simple soil indicators that we know are linked to these functions around soil organic carbon percentage, our available nutrients, soil pH, so the acidity or alkalinity of the soil, and some of these other ones that I've listed there. So if we're going to move to from a no but to a yes and when I think about, oh man, there's been some really stupid things said, not by anyone who's probably listening, and certainly not by Elaine. And I'm not saying like people aren't stupid, right? I'm just saying that sometimes they have bad luck when it comes to thinking around criticizing science in this space. Like, science is our compass for guiding decisions, right? Projects complement science. They're not a substitute for peer-reviewed research. And absolutely on the other side of it, scientists need to realize that applying some of this thinking in the field absolutely needs farmer innovation and adaptation, right? It's not about taking out a paper, putting the paddock. Absolutely, that's probably not gonna work out right. And do you know what? As a researcher, if we knew what we were doing all the time, it probably wouldn't be research, right? Like, just being a little bit fair to people like me sometimes. So if we now look and think, yeah, what are we actually seeing in the literature? How do we use this information? There was some great work that came out from Raphael over at Curtin University, and he was looking at the loss of soil organic carbon with some modelling under higher emissions scenarios and increased temperatures. And this hit the newspapers with, 3 arms in the air, like everything's going to be lost and we're doomed. If you actually read Raf's paper, which is an excellent paper, what it says is that, yeah, absolutely, we're going to be put under our soils are going to be put under increasing pressure. But we've got these management levers that we can pull to protect and avoid some of that loss and to build carbon back into our systems. And he absolutely highlights the role of our Australian rangeland systems as being a protected sink of carbon and an opportunity to get some of that uplift. If you have a look at one of his other papers, it was looking at the deficit of soil organic carbon in that mineral associated fraction. So what is the potential sequestration which can be stored in the more stable fraction in our soil? So that's kind of, it's called mineral associated organic carbon. And that's in particularly the clay and silt size fraction. So the less than 20 micron fraction that he looked at, he said basically there's a bucket there to be filled. And the biggest bucket's in the rangelands, but that's the bucket where there's the least water to fill that bucket. But absolutely, we've got practices which can increase soil carbon, and there's the potential there. Then if we look at Sinani's paper, Sinani at CSIRO, Raf looked at potential, so like how big is the bucket? Sinani's work used the SCARP data set to say, all right, in that fine fraction, so that mineral associated fraction, what's the attainable increase? So coming back to thinking not just how big is the bucket, but how relevant is that bucket for my farm? So thinking about climate and soil type and the vegetation. And so both of those papers found that there is a deficit there. So the bucket can be refilled. There's opportunities. And I've just shown you that there's practices to achieve that. This particular paper here out of the States was looking at carbon loss under vegetation change. So when you kind of rip out perennial pasture or more permanent vegetation and start cropping it, you get a decline in soil organic carbon. There's lots of papers which show that. What it also shows, though, if you want to slow it up, minimum tillage, we know that already, really by bringing perenniality and nutrition back into that system, actively growing roots for longer periods of time. That is how you build carbon in their study. And they kind of are advocating for rethinking some of our systems to have a bit more of an agroecological approach to cropping. This particular paper here was saying that there's no detectable upper limit of mineral associated organic carbon. So it's basically saying that there's a theory around saying that the amount of clay and the type of clay dictates how much carbon you can store in a soil. And definitely some of those modelling papers I just mentioned talked about this. This particular paper said perhaps not. Maybe what happens is all of those sites get filled up with organic carbon molecules, but then the unique way that soil biology and biological products are formed, maybe they'll kind of form associations on associations. So it's not just about the amount of, and type of clay. Maybe we can go beyond that, and that's what that paper was challenging. This particular paper was looking at, and this is a paper from Denmark, and this one was looking at the role of nitrogen and deep roots in getting carbon into the subsoil. And sometimes when I explain this to producers, they're like, yeah, of course, right? You've just said, you know, if it's less saturated and more clay, that is our subsoil, get roots down there, nitrogen drives that system as well, you can increase soil organic carbon. Sometimes we like to have a paper to show that, but absolutely this makes sense. So role of perenniality and nutrition again. Moving through these, if we now have a look at this particular paper, it was looking at build it and they will come. So what I just said there, put organic matter down there, put nutrients down there, there's a greater ability to store carbon, but soils are living. If you put organic matter down there and if you've got aeration, if you've got good temperature, soil organisms will also come. And that is the beautiful thing about soil biology. It creates more stable carbon, but it will also kind of have a priming effect on our subsoils as well. And we're learning more and more about our subsoils as we go. The last paper from someone who I'm a big fan of is Chioma, works for LLS. I think that's where she still is. And her paper was looking at the role of biostimulants and mitigating some of the drought impacts that we have. And so she looked at light and heavy soils, I think it was tall fescue, and looking at different rates of fertilizer and biostimulants, and came up with these really nice trends around drought tolerance and drought recovery, which 100% is an important thing to be thinking about when we're talking about building soil carbon. So that literature is like, some of it's hot off the press, some of it's like hot off the press, but kind of going, yeah, of course, that's right. So if we can't, just like as I'm kind of moving towards the end of my presentation, so I'm going to take up all Elaine's time and she can't virtually kick me under the table here. What I've done here in this slide is I've kind of come up with some of where we've got strong evidence, where we've got moderate evidence, and where we actually don't know. And these are the links between the practices that, you know, that producers in Australia have in place, and some of those drivers of productivity and profitability, soil carbon, soil nitrogen, nutrient cycling, all the stuff that really matters, right? And I want to stress here that just because we don't have evidence that something works, that's not evidence that it doesn't work, right? Science does not work like that. Like, you know, science is like magic, but it's real. but also we don't have all the answers, right? And if we did, that would be boring. And scientists that say we do, maybe they are too. Yeah, right. So green means that strong, direct, or positive evidence. So if you increase soil organic, so pasture type can increase soil organic carbon. We know that by pasture type can drive nitrogen fixation up to 40 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of dry matter produced. There's lots of literature around that. We also know that pasture type can buffer changes in soil temperature. Grazing management in particular in some papers has demonstrated to reduce surface soil temperature, and that's not a typo, that's between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. This is some work done in Western New South Wales in particular. And if you're a microbe trying to live in that, a plant trying to grow, or a livestock animal trying to move across soil, which is radiating that much heat of bare soil, that's going to be a constraint. So there's the data here to show. So our management practices increase the amount of water by up to, I read a paper the other day, 350,000 litres of moisture in the soil with increases in soil carbon. Around kind of the volume of soil that's explored by roots, up to 17 times more soil is explored where we've got good pasture type under good grazing management with good nutrition. Our soils are more disease suppressive. So these practices not only deliver soil carbon benefits, but they absolutely deliver a whole lot of other reasons we should be doing it. So some photos. If we have a look at where Impact Ag, shout out to Morocco, because this is what you're seeing on the screen here now as well, altering grazing pressure and duration, looking at nutrient supply. So in these particular soils, they're deficient in sulfur, applying sulfur to make sure that our legumes in particular have adequate ability to fix nitrogen, and of course, grazing management to optimize that window of photosynthesis and driving carbon below ground. We see benefits across the farms of our good grazing management and pasture nutrition as well, by great big bloody worms everywhere, which is exciting, dreadlocks on our roots. Good indicators that you guys can look for. Our cover crops are a good preparation before we go into pastures and a good feed for livestock. In our cropping systems, what we do is look at maintaining stubble and incorporating stubble through livestock grazing management, cover crops in some of our irrigated cropping country, and then also having a look at companion cropping. So as I said before, if we knew what we're doing all the time, it probably wouldn't be called research. So we're doing on-farm research as well. Now, these quantifiable practices, I term them as soil-friendly practices. They're all evidence-based. What they do is they activate ecological processes, and that's the stuff that sits in the literature in some of those big tables that were just kind of highlighted dark green and light green. And we know that there's measurable natural capital outcomes to do that, whether it's through a registered soil carbon project with the ACCU scheme, and if that's not for you, there's all of those other core benefits that you can get from adopting some of these practices, but making sure that it's contextually right for your soil and that you're always focused on growing soil.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Susan. I know we've not been fair to you by putting you under time pressure, and really appreciate your enthusiasm
Elaine's
delivery.
never going to let me go first again because I bloody do this to her all the time. I'm
That's
so sorry,
okay.
Elaine. Next
We've
time, you first.
we've got time. When we're under no real time pressure, I think everyone's keen to hear everything you both have to say. So no stress, Elaine. You take your time, and I'll leave you to it.
Good stuff. Thank you. I'm hoping you're all seeing my screen now. I haven't messed that up. So my name, I've already been introduced. My name is Elaine Mitchell. I am a researcher based at QUT. I think whenever I sort of go into these presentations as an academic, I like to say I've not always been an academic. I did work on the other side of things as a carbon project developer under the United Nations framework when I was still living in the UK. And then once I finished my PhD, I was also working for a pastoral company as the kind of ESG, so that's environmental, social, and governance, managing their carbon projects and communicating environmental benefits to their investors, a company called PACCORS. So that's just me trying to say that I don't just sit in my ivory tower and cast judgment on what is happening on the ground. But thank you very much for having me along. I've done some work with Atlas over the years. Had a great bit of time working with Bart Davidson and others, probably about 2 or 3 years ago now. But I've always appreciated the approach that Atlas has taken to its soil carbon projects, following the evidence, and giving their customers a realistic expectations of what they can achieve on the ground. So I respect and appreciate the approach that they've chosen to take. So anyway, moving on, I'm going to be presenting the results from some research that took place at QUT. This was funded by MLA and McDonald's. We were looking at, this presentation will mainly show the results from our time control grazing trials, but also just quickly mention some results we had from the incorporation of legumes and the impact on carbon storage. So first up, I think you'll all be aware, hopefully anyway, of what is time control grazing, but a nice little graphic there generated courtesy of my friend ChatGPT. But the idea is that we're looking at systems where we've got really high density grazing for short duration. And sorry, I'm just minimizing the screen there to actually read what's on the slides. So yes, high density, short duration, and we're looking for these long rest periods to try and ensure that we're maintaining the plant in this vigorous phase of growth. So in terms of the method we looked at, then we had 5 paired farms. So we have, farm A, which is your continuously grazed farm, and then you've got farm B, which is your time control grazing farm. Obviously, in a more ideal scenario, we wanted to look at the differences between these two farming systems would be to, transport ourselves back in time 20 years and then establish the management and set it off and monitor it over time. But we don't have that luxury. And the next best thing is to try and match farms as close as we possibly can, with the only difference being the way that they're being managed. So when we were going about this study, we took a lot of time and resources went into matching our farms then. They were side by side, so climate was already matched. We looked into soil type, land use history, etc. And the farms were then concentrated in the Brigalow belt of Queensland. Mention to what has come before us. So as scientists, we always have to build on previous research. And probably the thing that most people will look to is that there was a big meta-analysis done in Australia. So meta-analysis means all the studies that have been done on grazing management and kind of summarizing and putting them together and saying, overall, is there effect of grazing management on soil carbon stock? So this was the most recent one done. This was done in 2024 by Sarah McDonald and her colleagues. I've just highlighted what they came up with then, and if you can't read it, I'll read it for you. Not because I'm accusing you of not being able to read, but it's very small. While there's a lack of evidence in Australia that grazing management directly increases soil carbon, this meta-analysis indicated that grazing management practices have potential to benefit the drivers of soil carbon sequestration by increasing above and below ground plant production, maintaining higher residual biomass, and promoting productive perennial pasture species. So there was some indication that grazing management was having a positive impact, but because there were some studies showing it had a positive impact, some studies showing it had a negative impact, overall, they just couldn't determine whether overall, grazing management was having an impact on soil carbon stocks. Now, when we went into our study, this was obviously the background when this was written probably in the first year we were doing our study. And we were very cognizant to try and overcome some of the constraints that we saw in previous studies. So, for example, a lot of the studies were done at plot scale rather than on commercial farms. In some cases, we thought there was insufficient replication, so maybe they were just comparing one pair, so one conventional versus one time control grazing. So in our study, we increased this to 5 farms, so 5 conventional, 5 time control grazing. One of the most highly cited time control grazing studies that was done in Queensland, we thought there was a lot of confounding factors in the study because the farms were very geographically spread out on a number of different soil types. So when you come to try and tease out the management impact, it's overridden by the climatic gradient and also the differences in soil type. Another thing was study duration. So a lot of them just looked at change over 3 years. Again, with soil depth, some of them just measured down to 10 centimeters, some were 30 centimeters, but we went down to a meter to try and capture the full change that was occurring. And the last point I'll make is that some of the studies were using, looking at time control grazing management on the same farm. So we had the same farmer making the same decisions. And so they're not considering the farmer as an active decision maker in the outcomes. The study on the right is probably in contrast. There's a lot of research coming out of the United States that is showing that this system of time control grazing, these high density, short duration rotations, are increasing soil carbon and nitrogen stocks. And that's actually what we found in our study. So hopefully that gives you a flavour then of how we approached our study in order to try and overcome what we viewed as some limitations of previous research. So moving into the more exciting stuff is looking at the actual results of what we saw. Get this up here, sorry, move that there. So in terms of the soil organic carbon, then we have this nice graph here illustrating. So here we have along the bottom here, we have our conventionally grazed farms versus our time control grazing farms. So this is improved management that we see under the time control grazing farms. And you can see that there is a significantly higher amount of carbon that we found in the time control grazing properties here in the kind of yellowy gold color. And then if we're comparing between time control grazing and conventional, there's about 15 tons of carbon greater in the time control grazing systems. So if we try and annualize that rate, so the average age of establishment of these time control grazing systems was 22 years. Obviously, that's the average. Some are more, some are less, but over an average of 22 years, then that equates to a rate of carbon sequestration of about 0.67 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So quite a significant difference between the two. It was a similar story then when we looked at nitrogen down to the depth of a meter. So again, we're seeing greater nitrogen stocks in our time control grazing system. So that matches nicely with what we saw with the carbon. And this here, these graphs are always a bit of a headache to look at. But the main thing I want you to take away is that most of the difference that we saw was down to about half a meter. So where we see the difference between these two lines, it shows that there's a difference between the management systems. So you can see that this difference in carbon, for example, persists until we get down to just over about half a meter's depth. And then the lines start overlapping, meaning there is no significant difference between the two treatments. So most of the difference then occurring in the top 50 centimeters of the soil in terms of grazing management. What was also great to see was that these systems were storing more stable carbon. So Sue's really nicely teed that up for me, showing, talking about the importance of clay minerals in the soil for essentially, we get these organic and mineral associations, which gives us our stable carbon. That's a carbon, it's not going to stay there forever, but it's much more likely to persist in the soil than much more labile forms, which will be turned over more readily and lost from the soil system as carbon dioxide are respired by the microbes much more easily. So the obvious next question is why? Why are we seeing greater carbon and nitrogen stocks in these time control grazing systems? So we looked at three main things. We looked at soil microbial activity, we looked at plant functional diversity, we also looked at ground cover. And starting with the microbial biomass. So overall then, on the left-hand side here, we have the fungal biomass. On the right-hand side, we have the bacterial biomass. Now, this graph is slightly complicated comparison to the last two because we've got some extra treatments in here, but these are important because we have a cropping, we measured in a cropping system, and we also measured in a remnant forest, all nearby where we were also measuring the conventional versus the time control grazing systems. Again, these sites were matched for things like soil type, etc. But what you'll notice then is that we see significantly higher fungal biomass and bacterial biomass in the time control grazing versus conventional. And what I think is interesting is actually you see almost the same amount of fungal biomass in the time control grazings, if you compare them then to the remnant systems, the remnant forest systems, which I think is a really encouraging outcome. What we know about cropping systems then is they've been decimated over time for their microbial content because of the constant soil disruption and breaking apart soil structure, which has resulted in a much lower microbial biomass overall. In terms of who is there, I think I just put this slide up because I think this is still an area that there's still a lot of active research taking place. We have a soil microbiologist at QUT's work who's busy working through some of these ideas. But what I do hear in the kind of regen ag space a lot is that it's all down to who is in the soil. So what I think the main finding from our work has been that these time control systems just increase the overall amount of fungal biomass and bacterial biomass, which is means more healthy, more actively cycling soils, which are generating microbial necromass, which can then be stabilized. I can't remember where I was going with that, sorry. So, but what I do hear in regen ag circles is that it's down to things like, higher contents of AMF fungi, so our arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And also I hear a lot about this fungal to bacterial ratio. So the idea that you've got to somehow try and increase your ratio of fungi to bacteria in order to improve your systems. So we didn't see evidence of that. So I think that's an area that needs to be further explored. In terms of plant functional diversity, we didn't, the results were a bit complex, mixed results. I can't summarize very quickly here, but there was overall no real clear difference between the plant functional diversity between our time controlled and our conventional sites. But what I do want to mention is that we also were doing another study at the same time where we were looking at the incorporation of deep-rooted legumes into the system. So we looked at the one called Dysamanthus, and we found that it increased carbon and nitrogen content. Now, what's interesting about what we found here, if you remember where we saw most of the difference in the time control grazing systems, it was in the top kind of half meter down to 50 centimeters. What we saw in the legume trial was that most of the difference then was occurring at depth. So again, if I'm referring to these lines, we see that they're overlapping down to say about 30 or 40 centimeters, and then we get the significant difference between the two treatments. So the legumes, we think, are causing these nice deep-rooted legumes. We hypothesize anyway that they're channeling carbon deeper into the soil profile, where it's less likely to be The last thing that I'll mention that we looked at was differences in ground cover. Now, this is just a conceptual diagram that I'm showing you here. So this is what we expect to see when we use satellite imagery to look at ground cover change over time. So this was a nice piece of work to do because the soil carbon data was just static. It just meant that we were taking data at one point in time. But when we looked at ground cover, we were able to generate some time series information to see if there was divergence between the two different management systems when the intervention took place. So this is kind of a conceptual idea of what we expected to see. So pre-intervention, so here's where the management change is occurring, where we have this dotted black line here. So the management change in this kind of hypothetical scenario in 2005. So before that point in time, the ground cover proportion was roughly similar between the two treatments. However, when the intervention takes place, then we get higher ground cover proportion occurring under the improved management in the time control grazing systems. So that's all derived from satellite imagery that is open access for people to see. So what we did see though, sorry. So this is series from 1992 present day on the x-axis, And you can see then that this is kind of a smooth average over time, but you can see that the distance between the lines remains roughly similar over the entire period of monitoring. So we didn't detect that with the implementation of TCG that there was an increase or decrease relative to the business as usual. What we did notice then was that ground cover in the conventionally managed systems, that's shown, sorry, I should have said by the green line, this dipped much more frequently below a certain threshold, which is shown by these kind of red circles here. So this is an example from one of the pairs. So we were able to analyze that although ground cover, there wasn't a difference overall, during dry periods, ground cover dipped much more frequently in the conventionally grazed system. So it demonstrated to us, or we could infer from that in the time-controlled grazing systems, they were better at holding on to their ground cover, particularly during dry periods. Next steps in terms of what we're doing at QTF, what was worth mentioning, we're trying to build a kind of independent evidence base to strengthen confidence in sustainability and natural capital reporting for the Australian beef industry. We've got a number of sites up and running. This is operating under the TERN, which is the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. So we're receiving government funding for this. It's another acronym for you up there, ALTAR. My goodness me, too many acronyms. Australian Long-Term Agricultural Research. And I think long-term is really worth emphasizing. I think that we've got a really, really good grasp on what happens spatially with carbon and understanding what gives us that spatial pattern in terms of topography and soil type and all of that. So I think we've got a good way of predicting soil carbon spatially, but in terms of understanding what the dynamics over time, we just don't have enough long-term data sets. If you think about a lot of data sets in the research world, they're based around funding cycles of say 3 to 5 years. So we need these long-term independent data sets to provide a better evidence base of what's going on in Australian agricultural systems. So we've got currently about 10 hub sites, which are heavily instrumented. So they're indicated by the stars on the diagram on the right. So in terms of, we throw a whole bunch of measurements at these hub sites, and then we're tapping in also with the with producer demonstration sites, with MLA, and also under the net zero emissions CRC. So combining these heavily instrumented hub sites with other producer demonstration sites. In terms of the measurements that we're taking, we're looking at soil carbon, water and carbon balance, pasture biomass, woody biomass, ecoacoustics and biodiversity. So trying to get the whole suite of kind of natural capital and sustainability reporting. And in terms of the management interventions that we're looking at, some of the ones that Suze was mentioning earlier, things like pasture renovation, soil amelioration, looking at woody regrowth, landscape rehydration, fire management, grazing management, all of these things, really trying to get a better handle of what's going on in Australian systems. So I'll finish up with this lovely picture here of me. This is one of the main pieces of kit that we're deploying. This is me at a property in central Queensland. It's a very nice picture, but I am being eaten alive by mosquitoes in this picture. They sense the Scottish blood and they honed in pretty quick on me. But this is the main piece of kit that we're using to try and get a much higher resolution understanding of what's happening in terms of carbon and water balance in Australian agricultural systems. I think that soil coring, most people are taking those, say, every, sometimes every 5 years. You really don't get a good understanding of what's happening with soil carbon if you've got this big gap between 1 and 5 years. And what we really need to understand is, particularly in Australian systems, which experience much more variability than anywhere else in the world, about 25% more rainfall variability, what's happening to soil carbon in these boom and bust cycles when it's, we experience drought and then flooding, what's happening to soil carbon in those periods. So we're generating these high resolution data sets and trying to improve our understanding that way. That's just an example of the sort of data that's coming off. The flux tower data is at the top there, and you see that we're getting measurements. The flux tower takes a measurement every 20 seconds. So very high resolution data that will hopefully improve our understanding of exactly what's going on in these systems. I will finish off just with this slide here. This is a bit of a controversial topic. This paper that I've just done the screenshots of on the right-hand side there got me in a bit of bother, I think, with a lot of the carbon developers. But I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, the type of numbers that Sue's presented, and this graph is showing, you know, in this study, we looked at 0.67 tons of carbon per hectare per year. The ACU scheme has been crediting really high rates of sequestration, which make me incredibly nervous. So I think, you know, when you're doing your planning, follow the science, follow what we know, and just be a bit wary of anyone saying that they can sequester, you know, these incredible rates. The unfortunate part is there's not much transparency in the system to understand what potentially could be going wrong, but in some instances, they're just biophysically impossible to achieve those particular rates. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, was that, you know, in terms of the kind of, this is a kind of roughly, it's a very rough figure of the amount of carbon that's emitted through enteric methane. So in terms of the amount of carbon we need to sequester to offset emissions, if you're looking at insetting at the farm scale, is not that much. So we don't need these massive numbers in order to achieve our goals of, you know, potentially being carbon neutral. So hey, I just thought I'd put those into a bit of context at the end there, but I shall wrap up there, and hopefully I've left time. Well, there's only 5 minutes, sorry, if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Elaine. I really appreciate that. And I echo what you were saying at the start. Our approach is very conservative in that nature for that specific reason, is people like yourself have helped us when we got established to really make sure that we're very much grounded in the science and very much in conversation with scientists in Australia who are on the leading edge of that as well, particularly how grazing management really intersects there. So very much appreciate your views. Suze, I saw you were busy answering everyone's questions while Elaine was presenting, so thank you for that. You're still on mute at the moment, but what I'll just get you both to do is maybe say, what is the one thing that you really hope producers have taken away from today, from your presentation, or a key message that you think would be good to come out of this? Because I know that was a lot of numbers and a lot of data, but it's all really valuable stuff. And we will be sharing this around for people to revisit again as well when the recording's ready.
Shall I go first, Suze?
Yeah, because
I think there was a lot of information there, and I do apologize, but I think that people can go back and look at the recording and maybe digest parts that they're more interested in. But for me, it's about saying, I think that soil carbon sequestration is definitely achievable, but let's be realistic about what we can expect to achieve in the time frame over the 25 years.
Anything from you, Suze?
yeah, I was just trying to just do one. I'll do two. Thank you for letting me, because you can't say no now. I often get asked, like, what's the most important driver of soil health? And it is on farms, and it is people, right? And that kind of, it is farmers. So just not underestimating that. And that leads into my kind of point, is that it's farmers and plants and animals which build soil carbon, not like machines that go Bing and satellites and stuff, right? So don't forget that that's all the MRV, and that's really important. And it's great to have it's very important and essential to have lots of evidence. But don't underestimate kind of the ability to kind of innovate within your own farming context to build carbon. Where you see stuff working, try and think about why is it working, and how can you replicate that across other parts of the farm.
Beautiful. I don't think we have time for too many questions. I know we've answered some in the background. If when anyone would like to send in their questions via email, we will filter them to Elaine and Suze if they're happy to answer as well, and we'll get some answers for you. But just wanted to say thank you so much to both Dr. Elaine Mitchell, Dr. Susan Orgill. I cannot thank you enough for joining me today and sharing your depth of knowledge on soil carbon and grazing. The absolute best way, and let me quickly share my screen as I talk about this, the best way to get an understanding of this best, or maybe I should say second best, to listening to these two lovely ladies talk about their research is on farm. And we do host multiple field days to be able to help people understand how this is realised for people on farm, and what the practice change looks like, and what the day-to-day realities of a soil carbon project look like. And we are hosting one at Morocco, which is part of the Wilmot Cattle Company in Gunnedah on the 3rd of March. Now, that does fall the day before the annual Wilmot Field Day, which is the 4th and the 5th, which we will be at as well. So if you can join us, it is free, and we'll pop a link into register into the email as well that will come with this recording. But otherwise, you can just search for the Morocco Field Day for Atlas Carbon if you'd like to join us for a free field day. Anything else, please feel free to get in touch with us. You can visit the atlasag.com website. You can always reach out on social media. You can email us. You can call. There are many ways to reach us. And again, like I said, if you have questions, I'm happy to filter them through to the ladies individually. But again, thank you so much for both of you for presenting today. That was such an incredibly rich and in-depth topic. And I know there is a lot of chat about SOC levels at the moment in soil carbon projects, and I really appreciate you shining a light on your most recent research. And thanks for your time. We're bang on the hour, so we've done well.